All right, welcome everybody to the SIG Network meeting for Thursday, February 4th, 2021. First up, we have issue triage, and Tim will be driving that.
If I can find the window where I put you.
Sharing should be enabled, so go ahead.
There you are. There you are. Let's do a screen share. Let's do a window. Let's do, what's this one called? Node. Hopefully that was the right one. Tell me you all can see it.
Yep, looks good.
All right. First issue. We have a relatively low number, which is great. First issue, node local DNS with no track breaks Calico because Calico uses default drop, I guess, and therefore without running through the NAT table to get approved, these connections are not going to be allowed. Maybe something like that. I asked a question here just to make sure I understand what's going on there. The rationale for no track is listed here. I'm happy to take this one, I guess, for now, unless Pavitra is here and wants to pay some time on this. I'm going to assign her too. Okay. Add-on manager defaults the prune whitelist. So Jordan says, 22, we will stop serving extensions v1, b1. We apparently still have some stuff in tree that uses extensions v1, b1 ingress. Seems like an easy cleanup. Can we get a volunteer to finish this cleanup?
If you want to assign me, I like to clean up code too. So deleting code is always good.
I'm not sure you'll be deleting so much as changing, but okay.
Yeah, sure.
Excellent. Oh, closed. Nice.
Yeah, I just closed it.
We have a failing test, host port, no conflicting posts. This is Antonio. Did I convince you on that other thread or not?
In which one?
The one where I said maybe we shouldn't do this.
Yeah, but Jordan yesterday started to complain in 3 different issues in Slack that conformances should pass for Docker, and they want conformance passing with Docker. So there are two things: or you skip the test, or you fix the kubenet.
So for context, for anybody who wasn't in the conversation with Antonio and I. We do this thing where this is host ports, kubelet and kubeproxy both try to do this. They look at a port that they're going to install some IP tables rules for and try to open the port to make sure that A, we can, and that B, nobody else ever does. So that nobody gets surprised by listening on port 22 and then having a service steal it away from them. Because the kernel won't warn or anything if you install a port forward that hijacks a real port. And I thought we were being very clever back then, and we'd open the port and we'd just sit on it, not do anything with it, so that if we couldn't open it, we could at least scream about it, right? But it turns out that we just screaming about it doesn't really do any good because nobody looks at the logs anyway. And we're not really willing to not claim the port because that would be sort of a violation of the Kubernetes API. So what we're left with is all this logic around opening and maintaining node ports, which needs maintenance and apparently doesn't work in some cases, has known bugs, and a very little return on investment, in my opinion. So yeah. I was proposed. Go ahead.
This is a different thing. Tim, sorry for interrupting.
Oh man, I misread the subject entirely.
It's totally related, but this started yesterday. When 6 months ago, I opened a bug for Kubernetes to fix the host port.
I'm sorry.
And we decided to not move forward. then we fixed the test, and this test was migrated to SIG Network past week.
Right.
And then the CI took this test, and all the Docker Shim CI jobs failed conformance. And Jordan realized about this yesterday and started to complain. So I submitted a PR, or just to skip the test, or just to fix KubeNet, because
that's this one.
Yeah.
Okay. And the fix works?
It's the same fix that we have in Cryo for OpenShift.
Okay. I just opened it in a window. I will take a look at it. I will. Oh, it's already assigned to me. How about that? Okay, so I think we can accept this one. Sorry for the side conversation. We'll get back to the node port conversation another time. Removal of service proxy label on endpoints is not reconciled. I see J all over this one.
Oh yeah, I was just going to try to repro it on a node port because it's doing an external load balancer, but I work with Fengen, so I can help.
Okay. Yeah, my guess is if this is really a bug, and it sounds like it, plausibly could be, you shouldn't even need node port. It should just on any endpoints, it should be the same.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Okay. Cool. So you're already assigned. Thank you. Service refuses traffic to endpoints after updating the selected pod. So I see Antonio and
this was fun. One guy that was debugging something, and I think that it was DNS. It was hard to convince. So you can assign to me, and I don't know if.
Okay. It looked like a fun one. If you think there's really something going on there, please.
Yeah, but he's doing the heavy lifting. So I think this guy is awesome. So
okay.
It's just answering.
Node port service and IPVS mode depends on input chain policy to be accessible externally.
There's a PR for this already. So if this is triage accepted, it should be.
I think that PR is for the health check node port. And so I can provide a little context on this. So there's a few customers that we have where they always use like a default chain that's drop or reject. And we're discovering a lot of corner cases in DefaultNetworkPoli where we assume the default chain is accept, and that's why it's worked before. But as soon as you change a default chain to drop, like there's a lot of that breaks. And so the health check node port is one example.
So the fix here is to add allow rules in the filter chain?
Yes.
Okay. And that's being handled in that other PR?
Yes.
And you're paying attention to it?
Yes, I think that needs an approval from Dan, I think.
Okay. Rock and roll. Flaky test. Set of valid responses are returned for both pod and service proxy with path.
I think that these are one test that are these people from Conformance. I don't know the name of they are adding some tests to validate the API endpoints, not the endpoints in services.
Got it.
But they had a PR for this. I don't know if you scroll down.
Flake has been addressed.
Yeah,
okay, I'll load that up. It says it was merged. And there's another one. That one also says it's merged. Whoops. Off by one key. Okay. API server, dual stack API server only has a single IP address. I'm watching for Cal to explode.
No, I mean, we had talked about this in the CAP, or sorry, in the SIG meeting, something. I was actually starting to write up a
the last agreement was to have this as a separate thing. The only use case we found was an external client, external dual stack client, not to the cluster, but some VM outside the cluster trying to talk to the API server.
Okay.
Send this to me.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another flake, kind IPv6.
I don't have it assigned. This is something weird. I need to check it. Assign it.
It is assigned to you.
Okay. So I didn't know that. Sorry.
We're now into fairly old ones, November. This is the
I replied to this one.
VXLAN one. Oh, good.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically just debugging. I don't know what the
Okay.
problem is anymore, so got to get more info.
Back to square one.
Basically, yeah.
Fun. Okay. And improved service node balance. This is a good one from way back that it's still marked as not triaged. I left it open because I thought it was funny that it was more than 3 years old and not triaged. But I think it's more of an artifact of the way the triage label came to be. But I'm actually going to revisit it. So I'll assign this to myself. Unless somebody really wants to help you. Okay. That's it. That's all I got.
All right. Thanks, Tim. Next up, Antonio wants to talk about Docker shim deprecation in KubeNet.
Yeah, I sent an email to the mailing list. I don't know exactly how they are going to do it, but if they just remove the code from the repo, we are going to lose the KubeNet, mainly the KubeNet. So I don't know if I don't see any job running it in SIG Network test grid, but I don't know if anybody else is using
it. Antonio, what's the question here? Is it a concern around what will happen when it gets removed, or what actions do you think need to be taken?
If we need to do something, or just wait. I mean, I don't know if these things that once they remove it, a lot of things start to fail. So I want to know if there are some dependency on this KubeNet code anywhere.
I don't know of, I mean, it would be dependencies users using it, right? As far as I know, the major providers all do their own thing with one of the well-known CNIs or do something custom. Are there users out there using KubeNet? I'm sure there are, but they're going to have to deal with the Docker shim deprecation anyway.
Okay, then we are good.
Most of it's going to be like single node, or not single node, but like the quick testing installs and stuff like that. It's not going to be too many production workloads, right?
Not really. There are some cloud-based clusters, KubeNet. The other concern I have, other than CNI, is I've seen some code setting up the network using calls to Docker shim /network package. That was about a year and a half back. So I'll check if we have that, and I'll report on the Slack. And if not, if it's there, then we need to queue some work.
Okay.
That.
You think that's in ecosystem tools, or that's in cloud providers, or what do you mean?
No, Kubelet itself. So Kubelet has Kube runtime, Kube, and all the convoluted code that I had to go through, and then some of the code calls into Docker shim /network package, not Docker shim / network / kubelet package.
So I'm pretty sure that the problem there is just that the Docker shim stuff is not completely cleanly separated out, and kubelet is only calling into Docker shim network in the places where it's using Docker shim.
Okay.
So I think we're okay there.
Okay.
There aren't a lot of imports for Docker shim / network right now. Actually, there aren't any outside of Docker shim itself.
That sounds pretty happy. And anybody who is vendoring Kubernetes from outside is already in trouble. Okay.
Do we need to do anything with like kubeadm to specify other kind of network setups by default? I mean,
or local up cluster.
Yes, or those things.
Good.
That's what I'd be worried about.
Good question. I haven't been paying attention. I assumed, perhaps wrongly, that the folks doing the Docker shim deprecation were paying attention to that. I will have to look at local up cluster. Not that I've used it recently, but once upon a time.
Replaced a lot of code in hack and build.
Okay. I don't think there's anything here that's particularly, I mean, it's networking, but it's not like us causing it. It's the Docker shim removal. So if it turns out it breaks stuff, the whole removal will probably get stuck. Yeah, I still see some references to it in, oh no, those are just tests. We can probably remove those tests at the same time. Okay. I'm satisfied.
I mean, stuff like cluster GCE config default and config test.sh default to kubenet.
I believe there are some folks looking at that already from the GCE side, but I'm not sure who it is. I can look around there too.
Okay. All right, so it looks like there is some work to do. Are the people deprecating Docker shim going to do that work, do we think? Or is that something that we need to look into?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't even know who's the tip of the spear for the Docker shim at this point.
I mean, you know, they're going to have to, if they're trying to make the whole repo work without Docker shim, then they need to be setting up containerd or something anyway to replace the current tests that are using that, in which case they would have the stock CNI plugins and they could just use the bridge plugin or something. So it seems like they're going to run into this and deal with it, and we don't have to think about it.
I'll do a quick reach out to the folks that I know are working on it and see if I can get some positive confirmation.
Okay, thanks, Tim.
DIMS would probably be aware of all the players and what they're doing on this, it seems like.
DIMS is where I was going to start.
All right, so Tim will reach out to ask about GCE cluster scripts. Okay, all right, next up, cluster network policy.
Right.
That is the follow-up from last time. If there's any way we can hold it to 20 minutes, because we still have a lot of other items on the list to go through, that would be great. Do you think you can do that, Abhishek?
Yeah, sure. We'll try to be quick.
Okay, thank you.
All right. All right. Thanks.
Take it away.
Jan, do you want to share your screen?
Yes.
In the meantime, I'll just do a quick recap. Gobin presented in last meeting the motivation behind the cluster network policy resource, which is specifically for the administrator use cases to complement the developer network policies. Specifically, what we want to do is that cluster network policies should allow admins to write strict rules, which cannot be overridden by developer-written network policies, and also write some default rules for the clusters, which can be overridden by the Kubernetes network policy. We also looked at one of the proposal of the structure for the cluster network policy with rule actions. Essentially, we introduced three types of actions. The deny action to drop traffic that matches the rule, the allow action to allow, strictly allow the traffic, and the more complicated baseline allow action. But today we wanted to focus a bit more on the two core problems that we are trying to solve. The first problem is that of the precedence. That is exactly how the cluster network policy operates with Kubernetes network policies, and how we can create some sort of a bookend, I think in Tim's word, to the Kubernetes network policies to achieve the two administrator set of use cases that we were looking for. So previously we looked at rule actions to solve this problem, but there are additional ways in which we can achieve this. And we have documented those alternate proposals towards the end of the slide deck. And every proposal in a bit more detail. I doubt we'll get time to review all of those proposals, but we can do that offline. The other core problem that we want to look at is the selector semantics. Since this resource is at a cluster scope, we want to understand, or we should understand what the selector semantics are like. What does a pod selector mean at a cluster scope? So Yang will do a walkthrough of use cases with example to clarify these two problems, and how we solved it with our original rule action proposal. But then of course we can do it in other ways as well. But at least we can get some more clarity as to what those problems are. And also before we end, we hope to get some feedback on additional features that we plan to propose along with the cluster network policy as part of the spec. Something which is not core to the proposal, but definitely adds value to the cluster network policy resource. So having said that, Yang, take it further.
Yeah, thanks, Ajay. So I'll go as quick as I can possibly go here. So we have some sort of examples on the precedents that we prepared here. And for the first use case that Abhishek talked about, where we want to enforce some default sort of rules for every namespace. Here is one of the examples, which is the classic example we can think of, which is for every namespace that comes up in the cluster, the admin might want to restrict the every pod in the namespace to be only able to talk to pods in its own namespace. This is what we call a namespace isolation, sort of say. And if we consider a simple cluster shown on the left, there are 4 pods in 2 namespaces essentially. And because there are no policies, all pods can communicate with each other. Now, for this example, we're focusing on the pod color equals blue. And suppose the cluster admin wants to set a baseline rule for that pod to only accept traffic coming from its own namespace. Now, in the real cases, people might not want to apply a policy onto a specific pod. They usually apply policies to namespaces, but to be clear with this example, we only look at this pod. Now, this particular thing can be achieved with a cluster network policy with rule action baseline allow. So how we do that is that we select this pod as applied to, and in ingress rule, we say that, okay, we are only allowing traffic from this namespace, which has the metadata name equals DB. Because the baseline allow action, we want the baseline allow action to have the implicit isolation meanings, just as the current Kubernetes network policy does. So when this policy is applied, then what's allowed is the traffic from its own namespace, and whatever traffic from different namespace is denied because of the implicit isolation. So this pod color equals blue gets isolated because of this policy. And then it is entirely possible that developers of the DB namespace comes in and decided that the baseline rule doesn't actually suit their needs. For the developers of the namespace, they actually wanted this pod to be able to talk to the web namespace but they didn't care about, you know, whether the pod can talk to whatever pod is in its own namespace. So what they can do in this case is to apply a good old Kubernetes network policy as of today to open traffic for this namespace. Now, with this Kubernetes network policy and the cluster network policy we just applied, with those two policies stacked, we can see that, you know, because this policy selects the pod app equals blue, and it has an ingress rule to allow traffic coming from the web namespace, then these two traffic will be allowed. And because of the implicit isolation of the Kubernetes network policy, this pod equals color equals orange can no longer talk to the pod color equals blue. So what essentially this says is that whatever, if those two policies are selecting the same workload, then whatever the Kubernetes network policy says will completely override the intention of the cluster network policy that has baseline allow action. So this policy one becomes obsolete, or, you know, it's stacked upon. So everything specified here in the ingress rules won't take effect because the Kubernetes network policy has a higher precedence. So this is one of the use cases that we wanted to present. So the default the baseline allow actions, the intention will be, this is something that the cluster admin thinks that it will be enough for the developers for of the namespace to work with. So the intention will be something like, I want to provide you a baseline set of defaults, and it should be good, but you have the ability to open up or restrict further of the traffic that you see fit. So that, you know, these defaults can be override. But there are some other cases where the cluster admin wants to enforce some policies that cannot be overridden. For example, if the cluster admin wants something that, you know, for each of the namespaces, no matter what the developers say, the namespace, for example, should always be able to allow ingress traffic or egress traffic to core DNS. This is just an example. Or they should always allow traffic coming from a monitoring namespace. So the developers of that namespace cannot apply a Kubernetes network policy, which has implicit isolation and, you know, accidentally deny those kind of traffic. In that scenario, they can apply a higher precedence allow rules to enforce those traffic will always be allowed. On the other hand, if the cluster admin, you know, finds out some security risks posed by some other namespace or another pod, they can have a deny rule which dictates that this traffic will be denied, and it will never be overridden by developer-focused network policies. So this is such one of such examples. So consider a new cluster shown on the left. We have 3 namespaces, and we're still looking at the pod color equals to blue. Now, in this namespace, there originally exists a Kubernetes network policy created by developer, which allows traffic coming from the consumer namespace. And because of the implicit isolation, whatever the traffic coming from the monitor namespace will be dropped. Now, the cluster admin look at this traffic pattern, and it determined that, first of all, the traffic from the monitoring namespace must be allowed. And the second thing is that the cluster admin also found out the consumer workload poses a security risk. So what the cluster admin can do in that case is that he or she can apply a cluster network policy with allow and deny rules, which specifies, I want to explicitly allow traffic coming from the monitoring namespace. And I want to explicitly specify traffic that deny traffic from the consumer namespace. And as you can see here, if those two policies are stacked, then the cluster network policy with deny and allow rules will take precedence, because those two actions have higher precedence than the namespace Kubernetes network policy. So whatever intention specified here in the number 2 cluster network policy cannot be overridden by developer-focused namespace network policy. So those are the 2 examples we prepared here to explain this this precedence level, which is the CNP cluster network policy deny will always win against CNP allow. And then what's after is the Kubernetes network policy, which is always allow rules, then the implicit isolation of the Kubernetes network policy, and then the baseline allow, and the cluster network policy baseline implicit isolate will have the lowest precedence. I'll pause a second for any questions at this point.
So last time we talked about possibly splitting baseline out into a separate resource or something. I don't know if there's any updates for that plan today or if that's going to come at a later time.
Yes, Abhishek, do you want to talk about the supplemental slides now?
So yeah, quickly I'll talk about a few alternatives that we thought about. One of them that we considered was splitting up the baseline allow into its own CRD. Let's call it default network policy, which mirrors the Kubernetes network policy behavior, except that it's at a cluster scope. It does not have any action field to it. And then we keep the cluster network policy, which will be the higher precedence, the left-hand side of the bookend, which will have the allow and deny action. So that kind of like, clears the, or rather, the default network policy will be used, which can be overridden by Kubernetes network policies, and the cluster network policy cannot be overridden. There were other alternatives that we thought about. I think, Tim, you suggested the maybe a Boolean field for is overridable. That's also we have documented in the slide. There was another one, I think I remember Ricardo mentioning on the Slack channel that when you present 2 or 3 CRDs, he hates it as a user, and people might think that there are now 3 ways of defining security in my cluster. So the third approach that we thought about was to do some sort of a hybrid way, introduce a new section within the spec. The next one, introduce a new section within the spec called default rules. The next slide, please. Yeah, the default rules field is going to be similar to the ingress rules and egress rules, except that the default ingress rules or egress rules don't have an action field, and the ingress and egress rules have an action field. So this is like a hybrid approach of the 2 CRDs where both of them are being done in the same CRD. So we have a few alternatives. We're still brainstorming on what sticks, what feels more cleaner, and I think eventually we'll get together and have a preferred approach, which most likely will be one of these alternative proposals, and then start with the KEP and have also document the alternative proposals in the KEP. Does that sound like a good idea? All right, thank you. Jan, you want to continue?
Okay, yeah, sure. So the second thing we wanted to discuss is that the PodSelector semantics. So as you know, in the Kubernetes network policy, as of now, it's namespace scope, right? So then in the apply to, it has a PodSelector, and it only selects pods from its own namespace. And then in the ingress rules, if you have a PodSelector without any namespace selector, it selects whatever it's in the same namespace. But with a namespace selector, it will first select namespaces based on the label and then do the PodSelector. It is clear in the current Kubernetes network policy sense, but with the cluster network policy, the same PodSelector can be a little bit confusing because it's a cluster scope. So for example, if we have an empty PodSelector, right? Does it mean that we selected basically everything in the cluster because there were no namespaces bound to the cluster network policy? So what we decided is that we want to propose one semantics to the PodSelectors here, is that it has different sort of semantics in the apply to and in ingress and egress rules. So in apply to, if we have an empty PodSelector, it means that this cluster network policy will apply to all pods in all namespaces. If it has a PodSelector saying label matches app equals A, it will match all the pods which has label app equals A in all namespaces. And so essentially what the pod selector here in the apply to field will be cluster scope because it's a cluster scope resource. What's a little bit tricky is in the ingress and egress rules, let's say there's a standalone pod selector and it doesn't have any namespace selector to go along with it. Now, what this means is that we didn't want this to mean that we select all the pods from all namespaces, because an empty pod selector in that fashion will essentially mean the same thing as an empty namespace selector, essentially selecting every workload in the cluster. What we wanted this pod selector, empty pod selector to mean is that it will select all pods from the namespace of the pod for which this rule is currently being evaluated upon. So let's say there are 3 namespaces in the cluster. Now, an empty pod selector will select all the pods in these 3 namespaces. When we're evaluating this rule on the first namespace, this pod selector will take effect on the first namespace. And next, when we are evaluating the rule on the second namespace, this pod selector will take effect on the second namespace instead. It's a little bit tricky, so I will show some examples on how this will work. First is the default namespace isolation problem that I presented before. Now, if we have a policy like this, right? So let's say apply to an empty pod selector, means this cluster network policy will apply to every workload in the cluster. Right now, there are only 2 namespaces and 4 pods. And if I say ingress, I want the ingress rule to allow pod selector empty. This means that, you know, whenever this rule is being evaluated, this rule is bounded to that namespace. For example, let's look at the namespace A first. So pod web app equals web and app equals DB are selected by this selector. When this ingress rule is evaluating on this pod, it's bound to namespace A. So what this means is that the pod app equals web should only allow traffic coming from its own namespace, but not from other namespaces. So that's why, you know, there is a intra namespace allow, but inter namespace deny. And the same thing goes for the pods in the namespace B. Whereas in this case, we do pod selector equals empty. So every workload in the cluster is applied to by this policy. And the ingress is namespace selector empty. It means allow traffic from all namespaces. In this case, you know, every traffic in the cluster will be allowed as a result. Rather than, you know, for every pod, this will mean that it only allows traffic from its own namespace.
I feel like that's a little non-obvious, and we already have issues with non-obviousness in regular network policy. I'm curious what other options were discussed.
Yes, so I think as Tim suggested on the slide, there are some possible alternatives to this. We could do an explicit field for the same namespace for the pod selector. This is an alternative to this, where we introduce a new field, say same namespace, to go along with the pod selector. And I think in the alternative proposal here, the alternative is that if we want to select things from the same namespace, we will have an ingress which is called from same namespace and provide pod selectors there. And for egress, we'll have a 2 same namespace and provide selectors down there. So that, you know, if we have this, then without the 2 same namespace, the pod selector will still be cluster scoped. And if the pod selector is provided under the same namespace field, then it will be bounded to the namespace where this rule is currently being evaluated by.
So the main value I see of doing it with just the selector is that it is syntactically the same as the network policy, but it has different meaning, which I don't really like. But also, it means that the difference between an empty selector and a non-specified selector becomes important, right? And that's bitten us in the past. And so I think like I've pushed hard that we just don't ever do that, because not every language that we decode into can accurately represent a nil map versus a empty map. Go can, but like Proto doesn't always unmarshal into something that can detect that difference.
Why can't we just say spec applied to namespace selector : selects all here rather than overloading PodSelector? Or was that considered?
Wait, so Abhishek, you wanted to say?
Yeah, so the idea is that if we do a namespace selector, the semantics says that, allow traffic from all namespaces. What we want to solve here is that we want to kind of like copy span the policy into all namespaces. So we want, let's say, if we take up the example that Young showed about the namespace isolation, if I want to express namespace isolation, that is, with a single policy, only traffic, intra namespace traffic should be allowed. Inter namespace traffic should not be allowed. So allowing an empty namespace selector would mean that you're allowing traffic from all namespaces. So that's the semantic.
No, I was saying an empty namespace selector in the applied to section, not in the ingress section.
Oh, got it. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, you can apply the policy to an empty namespace selector. I think the semantics that Young is trying to talk about is for the pod selectors within the ingress egress rules. And how do we what is the meaning of a pod selector on a cluster scope by itself, especially when the resources are also in the resources cluster scope. It was easy for Kubernetes network policies because we can just say that this policy is created in this namespace. So a pod selector unaccompanied without a namespace selector means that the pods are selected from the same namespace. We wanted to do that similarly on a cluster scope basis. So we thought about like a pod selector by itself will only be selected from the rules that is being currently evaluated for the applied to pod selector. But it is very confusing, and I guess the explicit semantics is a bit more cleaner or easier to understand. It's just that what is the meaning of pod selector by itself on a cluster scope? That would then mean the pods are selected from all namespaces. Is that what we are comfortable with?
I was just trying to have some way of not having PodSelector mean different things in different places.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we don't have to do a full-on API review at this stage. In fact, it's almost impossible, right? I do think that this is an area worth thinking about, making sure that we don't make the mistakes that we've made in the past. And the general theme of those mistakes is trying to be clever always bites you, especially around selectors.
Nice.
Yeah, the more explicit we can be, the better in our language and not make things implicit.
I agree.
So time check, we have 13 minutes left. Are we okay with yet again punting the rest to the next meeting and continuing with our agenda?
Do you guys actually have a lot more to show in the slides, or are we down to like, it's time to go look at those alternatives and decide which ones we think have legs?
I think it's down to deciding on the alternative at this point.
Yeah,
So
and just one slide that I also wanted to bring attention to was the follow-up. Like one of the things that we were looking at, this is orthogonal to the precedence and the selector problem. Once we solve the core problem, I think these are like, a little more like value add features to a cluster scope policy. I think to make the poking holes of, deny rules and allow rules, we were thinking of like maybe having an accept field. So, allow traffic or deny traffic from all namespaces except kube system. We can do that with match selector or match expressions with a not in today. But again, since if we want to be more explicit, this is one way to do it. The other thing was, logging. Since we are introducing deny rules, I think maybe we can now also think about logging on a policy level or at a rule level. The other is also rule names or a identifier for rules. I think it's important when people want to do statistics on the rules, a way to uniquely identify a particular rule. So maybe that's something that we can think about. And then also node selectors. I think a lot of people were requesting, how can I allow traffic from pods to certain nodes, or how can I secure my nodes? Now this is a more complex problem to solve, and I think we should solve it in a separate KEP itself altogether. But these are some other follow-ups or things that we would want to consider as part of the cluster network policy. Well, that's about it. Thank you.
And in the chat, maybe you want to add to this list. In the chat, there was a discussion going about what, if any, sort of pre-flight we could start to think up, or how could we make kubectl describe show us something that is comprehensive, that isn't just the in namespace network policy and not just the cluster network policy, but something that says, show me the total policy that will apply to this pod. And even better, the policy that would apply to this pod if I make this change.
Correct. Okay. Yeah, we can add that as well. I think that those requests came a lot even for Kubernetes network policies. Like I have multiple network policies and this is my pod. Let me know whether I can perform this. So I will add that to the to-do list.
So this is sort of like a reverse query thing where given a pod or whatnot, I want to know what are the total policies that's currently regulating.
Yeah. Exactly. Yes, and do the stacking and overlapping and cancellation and show me in a human digestible format what would actually happen if I did this. Right. We have the same request for ingress, so we'll have to have that conversation at some point.
Matt, if you could do a 5-minute demo at one of the SIG nets, because your tool does exactly that. I've used it before, I think.
Yeah, I've been working on something that does this. It does it for existing netpols, so I'd have to, do a little bit more work to support Abhishek's stuff. But yeah, like definitely looking forward to that if that can help anybody.
Yeah, definitely. We can talk on the network policy meetings.
Okay, thanks. We should move on. And let's keep any follow-up on Slack or the Google group, or come back next time. Next up, Rob with Service API to Gateway API rename.
Is there one before me, the migrating a repo? Oh no, sorry, I have two. So yes, the first one is renaming service APIs to Gateway API. I sent something out to mailing list. I think it's pretty straightforward. When we started with the Service APIs project, we didn't really know what the resources were going to be. We built an API. Gateway is the most prominent resource in that API. And we've seen users naturally just start to describe it as Gateway API. So while we're still early in alpha, it seems like it could make sense to make that rename. If there's no objections, we'll move forward with that. But wanted to get some quick feedback here if anyone had any hesitancy towards that change. Cool. All right.
All right. Next up is, Saran Balaji, introduce plans for migrating repo.
Yeah, cool. So I guess Tim Hawkin might be already aware of this, but just to give context to everyone else, like we recently had a CVE where an unprivileged user can go update the service spec external IP field to some random value, and then they can hijack the traffic. So like when we announced the CVE, we came up with this validation webhook as a temporary solution, and we put that out, and then we said that to temporarily mitigate it, like use this webhook, and as a community, we are working on a better long-term solution. And when we launched the when we released this external IP validation webhook, like we used a SIG multi-tenancy group, and we are hosting the image using that particular repo. And when I was discussing with the Tim Leclerc, who chairs the SIG security group, he said SIG network was what might be the right SIG to own this particular repo in future, because there was one pull request as well where one of the community user wants to add a specific validation to the ingress IP field as well, whatever comes up in the service status field. So I wasn't sure like if we have to go add it or like, and I also saw that Tim Hawkins, like you already have a cap to like block this particular field permanently. So I was wondering like whether we should, or how we should, like, should we migrate to this SIG network group, this ownership, or like just have it outside of that, given that we are going to anyhow remove that particular field. So I wanted to discuss about that and get all your opinions.
So I think the thing is useful for quite a while. There's gonna, I mean, even if my change is in 21, but it's a config change. So if you're running in a hosted provider or something, you know, who knows when it will be available. But still, we know there's a lot of people who aren't on 21 who get value out of the webhook. So I think it's super valuable to keep it around at least for a year or two. I don't know if there's going to be a maintenance burden on it at all. It seems like. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was saying like we didn't have much issue on that so far, and it was just like one feature that somebody wanted to add as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it properly belongs to us. We made the mess. We should clean it up. So I guess I wouldn't object to making it our problem, although I don't know of anybody who's actually paying attention to it right now.
Yeah, that's true.
Is there an open issue or a proposal to move this?
There wasn't one yet, but when I was discussing with Tim Leclerc, he said like bring it up with the SIG network to see if we'll be owning, if the SIG network will be owning it, and if there. So basically, I was pinging him to check if we wanted to add any functionality to this, or whether we'll deprecate this completely. And he said probably to discuss with SIG network community first before we take any decision.
I mean, if we I'd rather not take it, but if we have to take it, I'm not allergic to taking it, but it seems like it's our problem. I would put a pretty strong moratorium on features. Like this is not we're not going to build a policy engine here, right? This is a pretty blanket thing until the even more blanket built-in controller is in everybody's hands. So that seems reasonable. If you want to open an issue, then we can figure out any last details and try to get some volunteers to pay attention to it, put themselves in the owner's file.
Yeah, sure. Sounds good. Yeah,
that's really what we're missing.
Yeah, sounds good. So from the maintenance point of view, like I can also help, like I can own it. So regarding that feature request now for that particular validation webhook where they wanted to add this on the ingress IP as well on the service status field, like, do you think that's valuable to do? Or I can follow up offline as well on the PR and then the comments.
Yeah, let's discuss it. I mean, I worry that doing it on status now is talking about like a different form of RBAC. Right.
The PR is from Justin Santa Barbara.
Yeah.
I don't mind breaking Justin's heart.
Yeah, so like I was speaking on that as well with him, and my thought process was like, since it's a status field, like whether getting the input as a CIDR makes sense, or whether it's validating against the user who's updating doesn't make sense. So yeah.
I mean, when the CVE was cooking, we looked at that and we decided that since status is normally RBAC to a different permission, like most users don't have access to right to service status, that it was not part of the CVE. Now, I guess I'm willing to have the discussion about whether this webhook should do the same for this field, but honestly, I'd really like to put a cap on the lifetime of this webhook, and so making it do more things contradicts that.
Right. That's true.
Okay.
That's okay. Thanks, Tim.
All right, Rob, topology cap updates. Back to you.
I will be quick. So there's a doc that I added. I made a couple quick PRs last week that we're going to update the existing KEPs for topology. And I got some feedback that made me rethink everything and say, hey, can we do this a little bit simpler? Do we need to closely tie subsetting with topology? Both of these are valid in their own way, but linking them together may limit both of them too much. So I've outlined what I think could be a simpler and potentially better path forward. And I would really appreciate feedback on it. I'm hoping to translate this into a KEP. It's in progress and hope to have that out tomorrow. This keeps a lot of the same concepts that we were already going with. It just says we could do subsetting later, and instead we can keep this information inside each endpoint. And that especially helps the smaller scale use cases where you have services with, say, less than 12 endpoints, where a subsetting approach just really doesn't work. So really appreciate any feedback on this. I know we don't have enough time, so I'll end it there. But if you want to add comments in the doc, reach out to me or look for a KEP PR tomorrow. And yeah, that's all. I know we're at time.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And really quick, last, Bridget, dual stack KEP update.
Thank you to Antonio and to Cal and to Tim and everyone who's put a bunch of work into trying to get this over the line. And we are almost there, and we need the PRR people to click OK. Thank you, DCBW, for doing so. Just giving you a quick status update. We're getting there. Hopefully that will get to beta in 1.21, but we do need the last little sign off before, enhancements freeze. So here's hoping.
To the same KEP topic, if anybody has KEPs that they need me to look at before Tuesday, please ping me and make sure that I'm looking at them. I'm trying to cycle through the ones that I have open and ping people and make sure that everything that was planning to get in is going to get in. I don't want to hear on Wednesday that I didn't review your KEP if you didn't ping me between now and Wednesday, or now and Tuesday.
All right, and that is it for the agenda. So unless there's anything else, going once, going twice. All right, thanks everybody. See you in 2 weeks.
Thanks all.